When we think about feudal Japan, our minds often drift to images of gleaming swords, mountain castles, and epic battles between rival clans. But there is another war that was fought just as fiercely, one that rarely makes it into the grand narratives of Japanese history. It was fought not on open plains, but on jagged coastlines, in harbors choked with fishing boats, and in the narrow streets of port towns where the smell of brine and fish mixed with the ever-present threat of violence. This was Japan's war against piracy, and for much of the Muromachi and early Sengoku periods, roughly the 14th through the 16th centuries, it was a war that the authorities were losing. To understand why piracy became such a devastating and persistent problem in Japan, you first need to understand the geography. Japan is an archipelago, and a chain of islands strung along the Pacific Rim like beads on a thread. This means that nearly every major population center, every rice-producing valley of consequence, and every seat of political power was accessible by water. The Seto Inland Sea, the body of water stretching between the main islands of Honshu and Shikoku, was one of the most heavily trafficked maritime corridors in all of East Asia. Merchant vessels carrying rice, timber, ceramics, and luxury goods moved through these channels in enormous numbers. And wherever goods moved in volume, pirates gathered like wolves around a herd. The pirates themselves were not a monolithic force. They were fragmented, opportunistic, and often deeply embedded in the political landscape of coastal Japan. The most infamous were the Waku, a name that translates roughly to Japanese pirates, though the term is somewhat misleading. Many Waku were not purely Japanese. They were a chaotic mix of Japanese ronin, Korean sailors, and Chinese traders who had turned to raiding after being cut off from legitimate commerce by Ming Dynasty policies restricting maritime trade. They operated out of hidden coves along the Korean and Japanese coasts, and at their peak, their raids stretched as far as the coast of Vietnam. But closer to home, in the waters surrounding Japan itself, piracy was a quieter, more chronic problem. Local maritime raiders preyed on the constant flow of goods between islands, and they did so with a level of sophistication that went far beyond simple theft at sea. The economic stakes were staggering. Japan's survival as a civilization depended on the movement of rice. The country's agricultural land was fragmented and mountainous, meaning that no single region could feed itself in isolation. Rice harvested in the fertile plains of Kyushu had to be shipped north. Timber cut from the forests of Shikoku had to be floated down rivers and then carried by sea to the great cities. When pirates disrupted these supply lines, the consequences rippled outward in ways that touched every household in the country. A fishing village that lost its catch to raiders in the spring might find itself unable to afford the rice it needed to survive the winter.
It's a total loss.
A merchant house that lost a ship might not have the capital to outfit the next one. Piracy was not just a security problem. It was a threat to the entire logistical nervous system of Japanese society.
We must
The
secure
initial
this
responses to piracy were fragmented
Our
and
forces are
often
stretched
ineffective.
thin, my lord.
Local
The coastal
lords,
defenses
or
are weak
daimyo,
here.
were responsible for the security of their domains, but many of them lacked the naval capacity to patrol their coastlines effectively. Some
Did you get the
daimyo
information I
actually
requested?
tolerated
Yes.
or even secretly
magistrate is
supported
moving
pirate
against you
activity
tomorrow night.
because
Are you
the wealth
certain?
flowing
My
through their
sources are
ports
reliable.
made them powerful, and a cut of that wealth, taken through raids on rivals, only made them more so. The result was a patchwork of enforcement where some coastlines were reasonably secure and others were essentially lawless. The shogunate, based in Kamakura during the earlier periods and later in Muromachi, issued orders and sent punitive expeditions, but these were often too slow to respond to the fast, decentralized nature of pirate attacks. A pirate fleet could strike a port, loot it, and disappear back into the maze of islands before any organized military response could be assembled. The coastal communities themselves developed their own survival strategies long before the central government came to their aid, and these strategies reveal a remarkable capacity for adaptation under threat. Fishing villages along the Seto Inland Sea began constructing watchtowers on high ground, positioned to give lookouts a clear view of the horizon at dawn. the most common time for raids. These were not grand military fortifications. They were simple wooden platforms, sometimes nothing more than a sturdy frame lashed together at the top of a hill. But they served a critical purpose. A single lookout with a clear sightline could spot a pirate fleet hours before it reached shore. And that warning was the difference between a village that was caught off guard and one that had time to activate its defenses. The warning systems themselves were ingeniously low-tech. Villages developed networks of signal fires, small bonfires positioned on ridgelines between settlements. When a lookout spotted danger, he would light his fire, and the smoke would be visible to the next village over, which would light its own fire, and so on down the coast. In calm weather, a warning could travel dozens of miles in under an hour. This was not a centralized military communication system. It was a grassroots network built by fishermen and farmers who understood that their survival depended on collective vigilance. The speed and reliability of these fire signal chains were, in many cases, now more effective than any formal military dispatch system the shogunate could have organized. Within the villages themselves, the response to a raid warning followed a practiced sequence that had been refined over generations. Valuables, primarily rice stores and fishing equipment, were moved to predetermined hiding places, often caves in the cliffs above the shore, or sealed compartments beneath the floors of the most inland buildings. Women, children, and the elderly were directed along evacuation routes to higher ground or to the relative safety of nearby forests. The men who remained behind were not necessarily trained soldiers, but they were not helpless either. Coastal communities developed a tradition of armed civilian defense that drew on the same martial culture that permeated Japanese society at every level. The fishing boats were heavy, low to the water, and difficult to board quickly. Men defending their shore from within these boats had a significant advantage over raiders trying to climb aboard in the chaos of an attack. The role of the samurai class in combating piracy evolved significantly over time, and its evolution tells a broader story about how Japanese institutions adapted to persistent threats. In the early Muromachi period, samurai naval forces were disorganized and poorly suited to maritime combat. Most samurai were land warriors, trained in cavalry and siege tactics, and the idea of fighting on a ship was foreign to many of them. The first significant shift came when certain coastal daimyo began investing in naval capacity, not out of altruism, but out of self-interest. A lord whose domain depended on maritime trade had every reason to protect it, and the lords of Western Japan, particularly those controlling the straits between Honshu and Shikoku, began building dedicated warship fleets and training specialized naval crews. The warships themselves were a fascinating piece of engineering. The atakabone, or armed vessels, were broad-beamed, heavy craft designed not for speed, but for stability and firepower. They carried mounted guns, a technology that reached Japan through Portuguese traders in the mid-16th century, and the integration of firearms into naval warfare transformed the balance of power almost overnight. But even before guns arrived, Japanese naval architects had developed ships optimized for the specific conditions of the inland sea, where currents were strong. The visibility was often poor due to fog and seasonal rain, and the waters were shallow and riddled with rocks. These ships were built with flat bottoms for navigating shallow waters, reinforced hulls for ramming, and wide decks for close-quarters combat. They were not elegant vessels, but they were brutally effective in the hands of crews who knew the waters intimately. The merchant class played a role in the fight against piracy that is often overlooked, but was economically decisive. Merchant houses, particularly the great trading firms that controlled the flow of rice and timber, began funding their own naval escorts and investing in the security of key ports. This was not charity. It was rational self-defense. A merchant house that lost a single ship carrying a full cargo of rice might see its profits wiped out for an entire season. By pooling resources and contributing to the construction of harbor defenses, merchants helped create a network of protected ports that gradually shrank the operating space available to pirates. Some merchant houses went further. hiring
secure
Ronin,
the area.
masterless samurai, as professional escorts for their convoys. These escort arrangements became formalized over time, evolving into something resembling a private maritime security industry. The physical defenses of ports were another layer of the survival infrastructure. Harbor entrances were fitted with chains or wooden booms that could be raised at night or during a raid warning to block the passage of enemy vessels. Watchtowers were placed at the mouths of harbors, armed with crews who could rain arrows or later gunfire down on any vessel that approached without identifying itself. On some ports constructed artificial reefs or submerged obstacles just outside their entrances, designed to ground or damage enemy ships attempting to force their way in. These were not improvised measures. They were the product of generations of experience with maritime attacks, and they were maintained and updated as pirate tactics evolved. The shogunate's most decisive intervention came in the late 16th century under the leadership of Toyotomi Hideyoshi, who unified Japan.
Our defenses
after
along the
decades of
Huso
civil
coastline
war.
are strong here
Hideyoshi
and here.
recognized
Yes,
that piracy
but the
was not
shallow
just a
waters near
security
Hyuga
nuisance,
provide an
but a
opening.
direct threat to the
By the
economic
authority of the
consolidation
shogun,
he was trying to
I
achieve.
hereby confiscate these
In
weapons.
1588,
The
he issued a
peasants shall
sweeping
no
decree
longer carry
known as the
swords.
Katanagari, or sword hunt, which disarmed the peasant class across Japan. While this decree is best known for its impact on land-based revolt, it had an equally important maritime dimension. By removing weapons from the hands of those who might turn to piracy out of desperation or opportunity, Hideyoshi dramatically reduced the recruitment pool for pirate fleets. He followed this with direct naval campaigns against the remaining pirate strongholds, deploying the full military resources of a newly unified state against groups that had previously been too fragmented and elusive for any single lord to destroy. The cultural response to piracy also shaped Japanese society in ways that persist to this day. Coastal communities developed a deep and abiding reverence for the sea that was inseparable from a healthy fear of it. Fishing villages maintained elaborate rituals and shrine practices designed to appease the spirits of the water and to pray for safe passage. These were not naive superstitions. They were a community's way of acknowledging the fundamental unpredictability of their environment and binding themselves together through shared belief and shared risk. The fishermen who went out each morning did so knowing that the sea could take them, and the community that watched them understood that vigilance, preparation, and solidarity were the only real defenses against a world that offered no guarantees. The legacy of Japan's long struggle with piracy is visible in the structure of coastal towns even today. Many fishing villages retain the layout that was originally designed for rapid evacuation, with narrow streets that funnel toward inland high ground and buildings clustered tightly together to minimize the number of entry points an attacker would need to secure. The watchtower sites, now often occupied by small shrines or scenic overlooks, still mark the same high ground that generations of lookouts once scanned for sails on the horizon. The signal fire networks are gone, replaced by modern communication, but the principle they embodied, that survival depends on shared information and collective response, remains deeply embedded in the way Japanese communities approach disaster preparedness. What the story of piracy in feudal Japan ultimately reveals is not just a tale of violence and defense, but a story about how societies build resilience into their bones over time. The fishing villages did not have armies. They did not have governments that reliably came to their aid. They had geography, they had ingenuity, and they had each other. The watchtower networks, the signal fire chains, the evacuation routes, and the harbor defenses were all built by ordinary people who decided that waiting to be destroyed was not an option. They observed, they adapted, and they survived. And when the shogunate finally brought the full weight of a unified state to bear against the pirate fleets, it was building on a foundation of local resilience that had already been in place for generations. The war against piracy in Japan was never won by a single decisive battle. It was won slowly, collectively, one coastline at a time, by communities that refused to accept vulnerability as their fate.